for the space to get the message out there. Thank you very much.
Until Mark joins us, inshallah.
Thank you very much, everybody. We're still just waiting for Mark, and we should be kicking off in about 3 minutes' time. Please do like, share, and retweet the space. We want it to reach as many people as possible. Thank you very much. And Mark is very promptly with us, so can you please send him a request? Mark, you should be receiving a request any second now. So please, as soon as you see it, do accept and come up as a speaker. Thank you very much. Mark, I've just sent you a message. Just trying to get you up as a speaker. Sorry, everybody. We'll be starting in a minute. Thank you. Fantastic. We've got you, Mark. Welcome. Thank you very much. And right on time as well. So, Mark, I'm not sure if you've done a Twitter space before, but it's pretty self-explanatory. Sorry if I'm teaching you how to suck eggs, but the bottom left, there should be a mic option. If you just click it when you want to speak, it unlocks and it unmutes the speaker, and then you click it again to mute it.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Fantastic. I've joined the 21st century. Thank you very much for inviting me to be on your show. It's an absolute delight to be with you today. Absolute delight.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So we'll get the show on the road. We'll just do some introductions and some general housekeeping, and then we'll start the space. So first of all, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I'm thankful for UK Somaliland Alliance again inviting me to co-host a third space with Dr. Adali. And we've got a very special guest who I'll introduce very shortly. As always, just a little bit of a blurb. These spaces are intended to be a forum within which we provide Somaliland and Somalilanders an opportunity to connect with the world. This is an opportunity to share knowledge with our allies who span the width and the breadth of the globe, and to equip you with the facts regarding Somaliland's unique case for re-recognition. In these spaces, we share facts, history, and spread a message of peace, love, and blessings from Somaliland to all our neighbours in the region, across Africa and the world. Before we start, just a little bit about UK Somaliland Alliance, our hosts. They are the foremost Somaliland diaspora-led organisation in the UK who seek to connect Somalilanders in the UK, enhance the role of Somalilanders in the UK, and also lobby within the UK to further Somaliland's cause. This group is not funded by any individual, state or institution, but it is a community-led initiative, and some of the most recent events they've held are the 18 May demonstrations, genocide awareness event, which had speakers from the directors of the Al Jazeera documentary, Kill All But the Crows. They've held events in Parliament with the community and politicians, and many, many, many more events and many more to come this year as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our special guest today, Mark Seddon. Mark is the director of the Centre for United Nations Studies at the University of Buckingham. Mark was also a former United Nations civil servant and worked as a media advisor to Maria Fernanda Espinosa, the president of the United Nations General Assembly. Mark was also speechwriter to the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, and Director of Communications for the International Commission on Financing Global Education Opportunity, which was chaired by UN Special Envoy for Global Education and former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown. As well as academia and international civil service, Mark is also a journalist. He is the former United Nations correspondent and New York bureau chief for Al Jazeera English. He reported from 18 countries during that time, including North Korea, which is on my bucket list, China, Haiti, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Ethiopia, and Democratic Republic of Congo. He has interviewed, amongst others, Ban Ki-moon himself, Tony Blair, Michael Foot, George Clooney, and others. In a journalistic career spanning over 20 years, he has been editor of Tribune and an elected member of the UK's Labour Party's National Executive Committee, the NEC. He has also written for most British newspapers and many magazines, including The Guardian, The Independent, The Daily Mail, Times, Spectator, New Statesman, and the list goes on. That's enough embarrassment for Mark, but if you want to find out more, please do Google his illustrious career, and I'm sure you can spend a lot of time doing that. So, Mark, just thank you very much for joining us. Just any sort of initial words before we start?
Well, thank you, and thank you for that very generous introduction. It's great, actually, because I've been a supporter of the Somaliland cause kind of for decades now, but without realizing that there were lots of other people out there who in this country who did the same. Of course, now and the past 10 years with the sort of spread of social media and how we connect with one another, it becomes very obvious that the Somali community has been in the UK for hundreds of years, actually, as you well know. My grandparents came from South Shields in the northeast of England, which has had a Somali community there for hundreds of years. And so it's been an education to me that, actually there are lots and lots of people out there who do get and understand and are arguing and campaigning for Somaliland. And so it's a great pleasure really to come on the show and to hear from you, actually, because I sat here rather isolated, like lots of people, like many of you perhaps. You're thinking, well, how do we change the world? Who's listening to us? But actually, there are an awful lot of us out there. So great. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much, Mark. Just before I give it to my co-host, Dr. Adali, just a few words on the format. So what we intend to do, we have just under an hour of Mark's busy schedule. And in order to make the most of this, we're going to split the sort of kind of time into three segments. Firstly, we're going to look at Somaliland and sort of Mark's exposure to Somaliland to date. Find out a bit more about actually how he got to know about Somaliland and so on and so forth. Then sort of kind of Somaliland's exposure to the world. Then finally, the third segment we're going to analyze some of the responses with regards to the MoU that Somaliland signed with Ethiopia. And then hopefully towards the end, we'll have time for some questions as well. So we've got a jam-packed event. And just before we start, I wanted to hand over to Dr. Adali, my co-host, so he can give a bit of a sort of kind of country profile of Somaliland and introduce it to our guests, our new allies that don't actually know too much about Somaliland. So, Dr. Adali.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Mark. Welcome to all of our listeners. I'm just going to give a brief overview of Somaliland as a country. I'm conscious we've got sort of approaching 200 people. We're probably going to get more people. And of course, there will be people listening to this space afterwards as a recording as well. So for the benefit of people who may not be familiar with Somaliland as a country, just a quick overview. So Somaliland, the Republic of Somaliland, is a country in East Africa, more specifically in the Horn of Africa towards the very tip. It is a country of 6.5 million people, approaching 7 million people, so a sizable population. And in terms of land area, I actually had to look it up earlier. It is a fairly large country that is slightly larger than England and Wales, Mark. For our American friends, it's slightly larger than the US state of Florida, but there are also quite a few other countries that are similar in size to Somaliland, but Somaliland is actually bigger in land area than countries like Bangladesh, Tunisia, Uruguay, Greece, or in the Horn of Africa, bigger than Eritrea, both in population but also in land area. And of course, Somaliland as a country is bigger in population than a lot of other countries. In terms of the history of Somaliland, how it came to be about, a couple of things for some of our new friends. Somaliland is not Somalia. I repeat, Somaliland is not Somalia. The names might be similar, and that might be a little bit confusing when you first hear the name. But of course, that's not unique to Somaliland and Somalia. There is Guinea and Guinea-Bissau. There is Congo and Democratic Republic of Congo. You know, there are so many Arab countries out there. So it's not unusual for countries to have some similarity in name or perhaps have some similarity in the populations who live there. But Somaliland is not Somalia. That's one of the key messages we want you to take away today and spread out there into the world. Secondly, Somaliland is an older country than neighboring Somalia. Somaliland was a country that gained its independence as part of the wider African decolonization movement in the 1960s. In fact, Somaliland was the first country in East Africa after Ethiopia, which of course was never colonized, albeit it was briefly occupied by Italy. Somaliland was the first country in East Africa to gain independence. Before Kenya, before Tanzania, before Djibouti, before even neighboring Somalia, but also before countries like Uganda. I know we have some Ugandan friends in the audience. So Somaliland was there on the map, sovereign and independent, on the 26th of June, 1960. And of course, this was during a time of Pan-Africanism, when countries were trying to unite. So countries like Somaliland and Somalia attempted a union in 1960. It went horribly wrong. It resulted in Somalia basically occupying Somaliland, trying to annex the country, and Somalia's government carried out the Isaac genocide, or the Isaac genocide. For anyone who wants to Google it later, it is spelled ISAAQ genocide in which Somalia, neighboring Somalia, killed hundreds of thousands of Somalilanders in the most brutal fashion imaginable. It's on Wikipedia, you can read it for yourself, but of course there is also a very famous report by Human Rights Watch and Africa Watch that carries, in a lot of detail, maybe 200 pages, the genocide that Somalia carried out. The people of Somaliland liberated themselves in 1991 through what's known under international law as a lawful liberation movement. To stop the genocide, which Somalilanders were successful in doing, but also expelling Somalia's dictatorship at that time, which is, of course, Siad Barre, very brutal and famous dictatorship. Since 1991, Somaliland has remade and rebuilt its country, many free and fair elections, 5 or 6 peaceful transfers of power from one president to the next, free and fair parliamentary elections, local elections, and presidential elections, a burgeoning economy, its own currency, flag, passport, parliament, House of Elders, central bank, military, police, flag, national anthem, as we have just heard. So Somaliland is a country that's on the map, but the challenge it has is it hasn't been internationally recognized yet. That's not to say that the country doesn't exist, which I think is one of the misnomers and the titles that we see in the news and the media, which I absolutely hate, because how can you tell 7 million people who exercised their democratic rights, who survived a harrowing genocide, who dissolved their union with another country, that they simply do not exist? I think that's one of the most callous things that's often said about Somaliland. But we exist, we're here, we're 7 million people, we're a big country, and our economy is growing increasingly. So context, Somaliland recently signed a deal with neighboring Ethiopia, whereby Ethiopia will formally recognize Somaliland's sovereignty and independence, and in exchange, Ethiopia will get access to one of Somaliland's ports along the 850-kilometer coastline, which of course is on the Gulf of Aden at the mouth of the Red Sea, where there are currently Houthi attacks and there is a lot of instability going on. In the wider region, very briefly, and then I'll finish, Somaliland sits in the Horn of Africa, which of course has been wrecked by conflagrations and wars. Sudan is in civil war, unfortunately. South Sudan is in conflict. Somalia has had a very long challenge with security and stability, and Yemen on the other side. And there sits Somaliland, bang in the middle, at one of the most strategic crossroads in the world for maritime trade, peaceful, stable, democratic. And of course, the world is increasingly finding that it cannot ignore Somaliland because geography is destiny. And now they're having to recognize Somaliland, accept its existence, and accept the democratic will of its 7 million people. So without further ado, I think we're going to proceed with the conversation we're going to have with Mark, but hopefully that brings you up to speed in terms of the history and the more recent events. Thank you very much. So Mark, back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adali, for that succinct, brief history of Somaliland, and I'm sure we'll go through a bit more throughout the space. Mark, once again, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. And I guess the first question that I wanted to open with is, after having Googled you and looking at your digital footprint, I've seen that you've been an ally and a friend of Somaliland for actually quite some time now, and probably more so longer than many of the people in this space. Can you tell us about your first exposure to Somaliland and actually what drew you to the cause of Somaliland's case for re-recognition?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what your listeners and viewers will make of this, but I mean, my aunt and uncle served in the colonial service. They were in Nigeria. And Dr. Adali was talking about Somaliland becoming independent in 1960. In 1960, Nigeria became independent as well. And I remember, my aunt and my uncle had a great interest in Africa. And they told me about Somaliland. And of course, I did a lot of reading about it. I was well aware that the colonial boundaries of the Italians, the British, and the French, let's not forget the French, had that had been drawn, and independence had come to British Somaliland and had come also to Italian Somaliland. And as we know, British Somaliland, as it became free and independent, inherited those borders from the colonialists. Now, that at one level should have been kind of sacrosanct to the then Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, because essentially, as you will all know, I mean, the AU and the OAU long-term policy effectively has been to essentially say, well, of course, we totally disagree with colonialism and how these borders were driven through by these European countries and what have you, but we've got to stick by them because here we can get stability. And so they've been hoisted by their own petard because Somaliland, ex-British Somaliland, came through with those borders and has been proving, as Dr. Adali was saying, just how safe and what a success it's made of things. So I've had the opportunity. I mean, I remember Siad Barre. I remember the war between Somalia and Ethiopia and the Ogaden. I've been to Mogadishu with the Secretary General, and I've got vivid memories of flying in on a United Nations plane and looking around at all my colleagues on the plane. Most of them were asleep, and I looked out of the window and I thought, wow, the plane is skimming along the top of the sea. And this was the approach to Mogadishu, flying very, very low to avoid possible missile attacks. So that instability and civil war that's disfigured Somalia was largely absent, as you will all know, from Somaliland. So that was my experience of Somalia. Mogadishu was like the Wild West. And I've also been to Djibouti with the Secretary General on a couple of occasions. I met the Premier there. I met the Foreign Minister. And there we have, seems to be quite acceptable for the international community to recognize Djibouti. So why not Somaliland? Everything that I've always been dear to my heart over the years has been this essential right of self-determination. Why should that not apply to Somaliland? I mean, right across the world right now, people are quite rightly protesting for the rights of the Palestinians and against the terrible things that are happening in Gaza. And central to that, as you all know, is this demand for Palestinian self-determination, to recognize the state of Palestine. And so I think consistency demands that Somaliland should also be recognized. So I've never been to Somaliland. I'd love to go. I've been to what was the Italian Somalia, and I've seen what has resulted from years of instability. And I've also been to Djibouti, which is recognized by the international community. So really, why can't Somaliland be recognized by the AU, recognized by the EU, recognized by Britain?
I can't hear Mark. I think maybe he's got a call that's coming in, but he should. Oh, perfect.
Hello, sorry about that. Did you miss all of that?
No. We heard. So fantastic. No, I think that's really helpful context. And actually, you spoke a lot more about aspects and elements that I thought you wouldn't touch on this early on, but it's fantastic to hear and really useful to present that to all the listeners in the space. I guess one thing that's very interesting in the case of Somaliland is the way that it's framed. It's always framed as if Somaliland started as a British protectorate and had no history beforehand. Some even nefarious accounts actually claim all Somalis to once have lived under a sultanate or a state together, but actually Somaliland has a very unique history on its own, dating back thousands of years, whether it's the Adal Sultanate of circa 1415 or the land of Punt, or, the 10,000-year-old cave paintings in Somaliland. And I think the sad thing is that message doesn't really get portrayed in the way that it should based on fact. Do you have any views and opinions on sort of kind of why that is, and why the international media has decided to actually give this account that's not factual, that's not based on any evidence, and portrays Somaliland as basically being subservient to, this notion of Somalia and, this one Somalia policy?
I think it's very convenient for international powers to essentially say, well, we don't want to complicate things. If Somaliland is recognised, then we have to recognise other so-called breakaways, even though Somaliland, as we know, would not be a breakaway. So I think it suits the international community. And of course, it's very powerful that the AU will not recognise Somaliland. That's a very, very real issue. I mean, I have to say that it's the Palestinian cause, for instance, went into abeyance, and until the past few weeks, and it's horrendous that it's taken all of this violence and death and carnage to put the Palestinian cause to the fore again. Unless you're kind of noticed in this world, it's very, very difficult to have your agenda taken seriously. And I'm sure we can talk about this, but I think there are lots of ways that Somaliland could be making its case internationally. I think there'll be a lot of very receptive, the public will be very receptive. It's the question of how you break through with some of these institutions and governments.
And I think that's really interesting, because privately and publicly as well, many commentators have actually said that Somaliland's just too nice. It's just too good. Does that sort of kind of bear any significance to why it doesn't get the coverage it deserves internationally? Do you think that actually, if it was run by a tin pot dictator, or if there was, war and famine, it would get more recognition?
There's something in that, but of course, it's run by a tin pot dictator, then you don't get any sympathy from anywhere. But I think the issue is how do you do it? Because essentially, conflict obviously draws interest in, and everybody talks about it. But right now, it's very difficult to see how you can make your voice heard. I mean, clearly, this whole issue about the agreement you alluded to, between the possible agreement between Ethiopia and Somaliland over the use of the port facilities is hugely controversial, and has got people talking about Somaliland. It's actually getting people to think about it and think, well, what's going on there? And that something controversial is happening. Whether, your estimation is better than mine in all of this. Whether this is good for Somaliland or not, I do not know. But I think that there's look, Taiwan, for instance, is another case, and I'm just checking, Shamaki, can you hear me still properly?
Yes, loud and clear.
Taiwan is another case, if you like, which is a powerful, good example. I think Taiwan either may have done in the past recognized Somaliland, which of course is a double-edged sword, because it then means that all those countries that recognize China then find it very difficult to recognize Somaliland. But essentially, I've been to Taiwan as well, and clearly the Taiwanese do not want to be part of mainland China. They've got a case similar to Somaliland to say we've got our own history, our own culture, and we have got our own way of running things. And Taiwan is a very successful economy. It's got a very impressive health service and welfare state. There's a lot going for it. And yet, unless there's some kind of military threat to it, it's, the rest of the world just carries on as though nothing in particular is happening.
And if I can just jump in there, I guess China and Taiwan, in a way, are very different. In that case, is very different, because essentially their dispute boils down to who is the legitimate representative of mainland China and Taiwan. with both of the sides claiming that legitimacy. And I think originally that's what their dispute was about, although it's evolved since then. Whereas, of course, the Somaliland case is very, very different. So on that difference, I do just want to pose a question to you, Mark, which is, one of the things that Somalia has been very good at telling the world to in terms of its narrative is this idea, completely false, completely untrue notion that Somaliland is a breakaway region or a secessionist state of Somalia. So my question to you is, how can Somaliland, which is an older country, which gained its own independence separately, completely separately from neighboring Somalia, while Somalia was still an Italian colony, how can it possibly be a breakaway region of Somalia? And why does the global media so readily, so easily accept those sound bites from Mogadishu, when in fact, if you just look through the archives, or you look at Somaliland's Treaty of Independence, or you look at the Royal Proclamation from Great Britain declaring Somaliland a sovereign independent country, or you look at the congratulatory notes, 35 countries that recognise Somaliland on 26th of June 1960, while Somalia was still an Italian colony. Why is all of that evidence so easily disregarded, and it kind of boils down to sound bites?
I mean, I don't know if there's an easy answer to that. I suspect an awful lot of it is because in your introduction, you were talking about the enormous strategic importance of the Horn of Africa, and also the fact that there's so much unrest and turbulence in the region. Of course, we're seeing right now the instance in the Red Sea of the Houthi Yemenis saying, we're going to, as far as we're concerned, is ships heading to Israel a fair game for us, and the West responding with military force. So this whole area is one of, as far as a lot of the people in the West are concerned, I suppose, and I'm talking about governments, as an area of real concern, because it's where so much shipping is going through and through the Suez Canal. And so they think, well, yeah, we don't want yet more of it. And this is because there's a general ignorance. For all of those historical instances and facts that you just referred to, there is a staggering degree of ignorance. I mean, you have to go and do a bit of searching before you see 1960 and the independence and the message from the Queen and all of those things that you're referring to, the recognition by those countries at the time. I think it's very important to try and be very clear as to how that amalgamation came about between Somaliland and Somalia. Was it on the basis of an agreement, but an agreement that you can secede from at any time should you wish? I don't know. I mean, I'm sure so many of these ideas have been thought about, but I would have thought that Somaliland needs to have a presence in New York if it doesn't, and at the United Nations. It needs to be lobbying very hard to say, look, we want to be independent, and we should be considered as a territory that has been potentially colonized, and so we want to be decolonized. There is actually a UN committee, the Decolonization Committee. You probably know about that. Somaliland could be part of that. I think that the people need to be educated. How easy is it to get journalists to go to Somaliland to educate people, members of parliaments, legislatures from around the world? I mean, I know these things are expensive. Somaliland is a well-organized, well-ordered society, but it's not a rich country. And so these are resources that people might say, well, that's an awful lot of expense to have an office in New York, for instance, at the UN, and also probably with the EU too. I think there needs to be really extensive lobbying and a real education process. And then, if it is possible to organize with independent observers a national plebiscite where Somaliland declares what it wishes to do. The people of Somaliland, in a democratic vote, declare that they wish to be independent. Maybe that's something else to consider. But I think that young people, especially around the world, see the rights of people to have self-determination, of small countries that have been bullied or occupied or invaded. And they really disapprove of this. They don't like it. They take a very moral view of things. It's not all politics and politicians. I think so many people take a moral view, and I think the Somaliland case is a very moral case.
I think, Mark, that's really interesting, because in the previous spaces we held, I think the one message that I wanted to leave, or one of the few messages that I wanted to leave with listeners, was actually this sort of case for re-recognition of Somaliland. Actually, I think for me shows, that people that are listening, that are retweeting, that are writing about Somaliland have their moral compass set up straight. And for those that haven't heard of Somaliland, I think that's our job now. And just going back to something you said about sort of media houses and journalists, and getting them involved and getting the message out there. Just today, a big state-owned media house, the BBC, as we know, I saw one of their reporters actually commenting on a post from a sort of Twitter handle that Somalilanders know that it's run by Somalia as a sort of campaign to destabilize Somaliland, and they were asking for contacts in Somaliland to run a story. One thing that as Somalilanders we've seen is the story is always told by somebody else. And the worst part about that is it's not just somebody else. It's usually the people that claim us, Somalians from Somalia, in institutions like the BBC, the Daily Mail, the big newspapers. They have a much bigger footprint. So is there any sort of words of encouragement or advice you can give listeners today who actually want to help spread that message, being Somalilanders or non-Somalilanders, just allies of Somaliland, and how best to go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, like what you're doing now, because a show like this is really, I mean, you can use this show in so many different ways. You can break it up, send it out, use it out on social media, take quotes. I mean, what you've both been saying is much of this information will be new to people, and yet I think people are interested, and so also I think it's got to be the case that if somebody writes a piece about Somaliland which is ill-informed, then you must respond, you must write, you must demand that that the other argument is put. I get what you say about other people writing your story. I think that's been a familiar complaint all over the world. Why won't people listen to us? They have to send somebody else in to do it for us, and then they invariably get it wrong. Or all they're interested in is conflict or scandal or whatever. But I think it's probably worth thinking about some of your more prominent supporters out there and how it's possible to get them to put a letter together, for instance, as one with various people as signatories. If it's possible to organise a country visit to see some of the progress and development. When I went to Djibouti, the government there were very keen for all of us to see the developments that were going on in the ports. The fact that the railway that had been disused for years, that went from Djibouti to Addis, I think, had just been completely rebuilt in next to no time. All of these things were very powerful. And of course, the Djibouti case has been, the Djibouti case is perhaps one to think about a bit more, because, it's obviously, it's always been highly strategic, possibly more so now with the conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia. But Djibouti somehow has managed to get itself recognized as, again, like Somaliland is, but people don't know much about Somaliland. But Djibouti has managed to persuade people that it is a stable country and a country that's worth doing business with. So, the Djibouti example is possibly, and you will have thought about all of this. I'm thinking on my feet, but I think having been to Djibouti, having seen the progress there, having seen how they're able to and have been using the media to get their arguments across, perhaps that's quite a good model.
No, 100%. And I think even though they are not similar in terms of, I guess, the the merit that they stand on with sort of kind of Somaliland's history and the case. There are definitely lessons to be learned there. I think one thing that's really interesting in the case for Somaliland, we'll get onto the MoU with Ethiopia shortly, because we have a number of dignitaries from Ethiopia and actually fellow African countries, including Somaliland. We'll get onto that and actually what it's done for Somaliland's case. I guess now we have the opportunity as Somalilanders, because what we see that the momentum is shifting. What I've been telling Somalilanders for a few weeks now is actually this is the opportunity, because Somaliland's been talked about. Somaliland's been searched on Google more times than it's ever has been in its history. So it's the time to fully utilize that. And I think for some reason, the hypocrisy in the international system and community won't abide. However, do you think that there needs to be something along with a legal and a sort of kind of moral and just case? Just thinking strategically here, how would you frame it as Mark if you were to sell Somaliland, I guess?
I suppose I would be starting from the basis of looking around the world at the Somaliland diaspora, which is it's a remarkably erudite and informed and educated community all over the world, and has historically been enormously influential. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on your show. I mean, the Somali presence in Britain it goes back to Tudor times. There's been there is that. I would be thinking about the diaspora, who you could engage to be your spokespeople around the world, and to have them put them up to speak to media, put them up to go and speak to parliaments, perhaps lobby here in the UK for the Foreign Affairs Select Committee to investigate the case for Somaliland. Perhaps you're already doing this, but I mean, there will be members of Parliament there, I'm sure. I don't know what the makeup is at the moment, but I know that the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee is a very impressive figure. She could be persuaded that there should be
sorry, Mark, to jump in, but she actually went to Somaliland not too long ago. Alicia,
yes.
Right?
Oh, well, very, very good. I mean, did the Select Committee actually sort of decide that they were going to organise a sort of investigation and a report and make some recommendations on British foreign policy? Because that could be something. Also, I mean, I know that, I mean, look, I was in the Labour Party for 40 years. I have to tell you that I'm very disillusioned by Keir Starmer, but that's my issue. More importantly, it does look as though there's a good chance there could be a change of government here. And I know there are many influential Somalis who are from Somaliland who are involved in the British Labour Party. I think, if you think in terms of how, for instance, the policy on Kashmir has been moulded by that involvement in the British Labour Party, why, the Somaliland, you could be helping to mould a foreign policy which is much more pro-Somaliland in the Labour Party. There's going to be a new government. It seems to me that you have to, there are opportunities out there. It's not all going to happen uniformly. Not every single country right across the EU is immediately going to think, or at the same time going to think, right, we'll change our policy on Somaliland. But it's, as you say, if there's more interest and more concern and more also, a desire for consistency. Why is it right for one country to have self-determination and another country not to have it? This is what people find totally unacceptable. So you've got a very strong moral case. You've got lots of people who can make it for you. I would think about what kind of representation you can get at the United Nations, because it's helped the Palestinians. And I'd be thinking about the EU too. It's very influential, of course. And, particular governments. Britain, because of its historical connections, no excuses. I mean, we're constantly having to remind the British government of its historical obligations to the Palestinians that it made in the Balfour Declaration. Well, Britain made historical obligations to you in Somaliland in 1960. So these politicians should be reminded of that. And there's a powerful lobby, I would have thought, and you are the representatives of it here.
And on that point, thank you very much, Mark, for some very interesting comments you've made there. And of course, with reminding people that the United Kingdom itself, only in 2016, left the European Union and dissolved a union with other countries that it was unhappy with. Yet, ironically, it stands in the way of Somaliland dissolving its union, or failed attempted union, with neighbouring Somalia, having been two separate countries before that. And I just want to stick with that theme of inconsistency. And if I was being more harsh, if I were being more harsh, I might call it hypocrisy. But let's stick with that theme of inconsistency. You know, you make a really good point. How can it be that some countries and some peoples have a right to self-determination? How can it be that all the other 54 countries in Africa, you know, have got a right to have ended their colonization and then have become sovereign, independent countries? Yet Somaliland, which went through exactly the same process, decolonization, independence, is now denied a seat on the UN, is now denied being a sovereign, independent country. So my question to you is it not in a way hypocritical when we look at the cases, for example, of the USSR having been a failed union of countries and they reverted to their former independent states? The example of Senegal and Gambia, which united to form Senegambia and then dissolved into their independent states. The case of Egypt and Syria, which united and that union didn't work out and they dissolved their union. And then, of course, the UK, the EU, the UN Security Council members have recognized more than 20 countries since 1991, including Eritrea, South Sudan, East Timor, Bangladesh, and a whole host of countries in Eastern Europe. So why is there that double standard towards, you know, a small African country that is kind of almost being deliberately ignored and neglected? Some would say.
It's, do you know what? I mean, as you were saying that, you're running through those extremely powerful examples. I was thinking of another very small, minor example, if you like, which is the case of Anguilla in the Caribbean, which was part of St. Kitts, Nevis and Anguilla. And the Anguillans never wanted to be part of St. Kitts and they rebelled. There's a fantastic book that was written by an American foreign correspondent about this rebellion on the island of Anguilla, and they actually rebelled to stay a British territory. I mean, an extraordinary thing. And the Harold Wilson, who was the then Prime Minister, he was concerned. He read all this stuff in the press. He said, oh, the Anguillans are revolting against us. And he sent the troops in and they found a Napoleonic cannon and 3 or 4 shotguns and were welcomed in the streets. Anguilla today is a UK overseas territory. It's separate. That's its choice. That's self-determination. People might think that's bonkers. Why would you want to be? But that's what they want. So that's fine. So why shouldn't it be from Somaliland? Is it hypocritical? Yes, of course it is. Is there a lack of consistency? Yes, of course there is. And I just wonder, because you asked me the question, what is the real reason behind it? Why is it taking so much to get countries like this one and others to recognise Somaliland? And I can't help that but it must go to the AU in particular. I wouldn't know for sure, but I don't think that the Somalia case in particular is one that gets a huge amount of support. I mean, Somalia, I mean, if you asked a lot of people in governments across the world about Somalia, they would talk in terms of instability, of, failed state and all the rest of it, whether it's fair or not. So it's not so much the Somalia case for Somaliland. It seems to me to be the AU. And that's the essential thing. I don't know how you challenge this because, you know, of course, you've got the issue of Western Sahara as well, the Sawaris. Now, people, you know, throughout the world recognize the Sawaris' right to self-determination. I think the AU does technically itself too, but nobody ever wants to stir the pot against Morocco. And we saw that Trump deal with Morocco, that nefarious deal with Morocco that cut off self-determination for the Sawaris effectively. But I just think that your question, there's all the obvious inconsistencies and hypocrisies but then the reason for it. And could it be that essentially it's the AU that's the real block? If you got some African, and one other thought that occurred to me, and just forgive me for going on, but one other thought that did occur to me is the Commonwealth. Now, I've got these links to the Palestinians for all sorts of reasons. I've been active with the Palestinians for a very long time, and I've been suggesting to the Palestinians that they think about applying to be a Commonwealth member. And although a lot of people in Palestine will say, well, what's the point of all of that? Actually, in many respects, it would be quite a deft and clever move, because in the case of Palestine, it would probably have almost uniform support right across the Commonwealth. And it would only be Britain sort of getting into an embarrassed corner about knowing what to do and eventually having to accept it. And that's another milestone for the state of Palestine. For Somaliland, I'm wondering, are there countries out there that are in the Commonwealth who are easier to lobby than others? Can you begin to get some movement there? Because that might be another way of getting into some international organizations and helping towards international recognition.
And just on that point, Mark, you mentioned the AU there, which I think is the AU perspective on this is very interesting. And of course, they did send a fact-finding mission. The African Union sent a fact-finding mission, investigated Somaliland's case, and in 2005 reported back that Somaliland's case is, and I quote, historically unique and self-justified in African political history, end quote. And what they specifically drew attention to was exactly the fact that Somaliland actually is not like Western Sahara or is not like South Sudan or Eritrea in a way, because those were, not sovereign independent countries before, where Somaliland was and is a sovereign independent country before even neighboring Somalia was independent. So actually it has its own claim to independence, towards sovereignty. And I think many of us are now actually evolved in our thinking to say, actually, Somaliland has been occupied and annexed by neighboring Somalia, which is really ironic because, as you were telling us earlier, in terms of your experience of having gone to Mogadishu, Somalia, of course, it is a failed state, and the government there doesn't leave Mogadishu airport, or the green zone is propped up by 20,000 foreign African troops, has no real territorial control inside Somalia itself, let alone neighboring Somaliland. So, of course, in many ways, I saw a very interesting article the other day that described how actually the Republic of Somaliland is a much more viable, stable, much better run country. How Somaliland today is actually sovereign and independent, whereas Somalia is not. And Somalia is basically a UN trusteeship under the auspices of the AU. But I think the challenge has been, and maybe this is where you link it back, do you think the AU should now follow up on that report that they themselves concluded that Somaliland's case is historically unique and self-justified in African political history, and therefore warrants a special resolution, which is what they called for?
Yes, of course. And 2005 is quite a long time ago, of course, as well. So it's bringing all of these things up to date, I suppose, and yes, and also I'm beginning to think too about what about some of the media links that you can do. I mean, the AU, I've been to when I was at the UN, I used to go to the AU summits in Addis. It strikes me that there could be events on the sidelines. If they don't happen, they should happen. Somaliland events, Somaliland media. Trying to get Somaliland spokespeople and others onto media that's widely trusted or at least widely viewed across the region. I mean, obviously, my old network, Al Jazeera, strikes me as something that's a network that would be quite fair and interested in the Somaliland case and would give airtime. So there must be. I suppose it's not just the question of reviving a report from 2005 and a recommendation, important though that is, but it's trying to get the mood music behind it. Why now? What have you got to announce that is so significant that takes us further and makes this case so unutterably unanswerable? That's the thing,
And just on that point, I think Shamarka will bring us up to speed, because of course we're holding this space because there have been some very recent and current events that do make this a much more pressing matter and a pressing issue. And of course, I'm glad you mentioned Al Jazeera, because they actually produced an amazing documentary, a 2-episode documentary called Kill All But the Crows. Kill All But the Crows, that goes through and shows in detail the horrific genocide that Somalia carried out in Somaliland, in which they killed hundreds of thousands of people, and shows all the mass graves and everything else. So Al Jazeera has done quite a lot actually to champion Somaliland's cause. So that's quite interesting. But I think some of the Somalilanders in the audience would kill me if I didn't just correct something that was said earlier in the conversation when we were talking about two things: one, a referendum, and two, right to self-determination. Actually, Somalilanders did hold a referendum in 2001. This was one of the things that the international community, the AU, pushed them and said, hold a referendum, we'll send international observers. And of course, there were international observers who watched the Somaliland 2001 referendum, and a resounding 97% of the people of Somaliland voted in a free and fair referendum that was held in every region, every city, every town, where they voted for independence, for sovereignty. But of course, the world and Somalia just ignored that. But I think, increasingly the world is realizing that Somaliland, and the legality is very interesting. So the Montevideo Convention on Statehood defines what is a sovereign independent state. 4 criteria. Somaliland meets all of that criteria. So irrespective of whether Somaliland is recognized by other countries or not, which is purely a diplomatic relationship between two governments, under international law, of course, Somaliland does exist, is sovereign, is independent, but it just doesn't happen to have those links with other countries or a seat on the UN. And Somaliland is not unique in that, because even countries like Switzerland, they only decided to get a seat on the UN quite recently because of its neutral, non-aligned position. Switzerland, for a very long time, although it was a sovereign, independent country, chose not to get a seat on the UN. So you don't even need to have a seat on the UN to be deemed sovereign and independent. So Somaliland has already had a referendum. Its people have voted yes. And of course, it's got a 33-year track record of being peaceful, stable, sovereign, independent. And it has its own post-colonial independence papers. But I think what is bringing Somaliland to the attention of the world again is the recent developments, and it's other countries realizing that they have no choice but to engage with Somaliland, particularly because of its 850-kilometer coastline on the Red Sea, at the mouth of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and with the rest of the region in flames: Yemen, Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia. They have no choice but to deal with Somaliland. So on that point, Sir Mark, over to you.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Adali. Mark, thank you very much for your useful and very sort of enlightening input. I think what was really interesting when you were speaking was actually when you were asking the question about the AU, and bear with me for a second, I'll tie it back into the MoU. Jendai Fraser, the former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, I think it was 2 years ago, mentioned how one of her regrets was actually not doing more to help in the case of getting Somaliland recognized. But a couple of interesting points that she made was actually the powers within Africa that were pushing against Somaliland's recognition. To some degree, we didn't have, that big regional power supporting Somaliland's case, pushing Somaliland's message and the legal status, as well as, the country's merits amongst these closed rooms in the African Union and many other sort of kind of decision-making forums. And what we've seen on the 1st of January 2024 was actually that completely shifted. We had Ethiopia, which is the largest power in the region, turning around and actually saying, as part of this memorandum of understanding, when we take it to fruition, we would recognize Somaliland. People are now, and countries are now, looking at Somaliland in a different light. I just wanted to sort of kind of hear what your views were around actually what you've been seeing regarding the statements being released around the memorandum of understanding, but actually, just as importantly, the recognition associated with that memorandum of understanding, which the Somaliland side have affirmed.
Ultimately, Somaliland, we all agree that Somaliland deserves to be recognised throughout the world as an independent state. It is de facto an independent state, and therefore, as such, it can make its own decisions. And if it wants to reach an agreement with Ethiopia on the port, well, it's up to Somaliland, isn't it? I mean, there's no such thing as a free lunch, of course. As Sri Lanka is possibly discovering with its deal with China over port facilities. There is you as well as anyone else, why Ethiopia is particularly concerned that it does not have access to the sea, which it once upon a time did have with Eritrea. So we can understand what is driving Ethiopia. We can understand what sense this makes to Somaliland. Asking me my opinion, I think it's Somaliland's decision, and it's not for anybody else.
But Mark, I guess what would be useful to understand from an external observer, everyone observing it says, I mean, this looks like a win-win deal, doesn't it, on paper?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, on paper. I mean, I'm not party to all the, all the discussions, and all I've done is I've read some, and whenever I read something, by the way, I always question whatever I'm reading as to who's writing it, where it's appearing, and all the rest of it. I mean, I think that I suppose the back of my mind always is well, we don't want another war between Somalia and Ethiopia, and one that could spill into Somaliland. And you'd be able to tell me, I mean, you've just talked about the failed nature of the Somali state, whether it's actually got the wherewithal to intervene if it wanted to militarily in Somaliland. That would be my big fear, I suppose.
And I can take that. Yeah. I can take that question really quickly. There is definitely a lot of saber rattling, scaremongering by Somalia, but it is exactly that, saber rattling and scaremongering. It's actually quite ironic to see the government of Somalia threatening war against Somaliland, against Ethiopia, when it doesn't even go beyond Mogadishu airport. It doesn't even control its own territory inside Somalia. It doesn't have a functional military. It doesn't have a functional police. And actually it relies on Ethiopian military forces to prop up and maintain their own president and their own prime minister. So it is a load of hot air. Yeah. And actually, I think it's more for Somalia's internal domestic consumption and their internal domestic audiences to keep the president in power than it is really to be a realistic threat to Ethiopia and Somaliland. Of course, Ethiopia is a huge military power, and Somalia is no match. And of course, what people forget with Somaliland as well, Mark, is that for 33 years, we haven't been around for no reason. It is because our security forces have been doing a really good job at keeping Al-Shabaab at bay, at keeping our borders secure, at securing the peace of Somaliland.